Ready for another great session.
Great session. Well, we love enfants terribles in Gamelab, don't we?
Definitely.
I don't know if the people that we have with us today, now, they would define themselves like that, but for sure they have something different, a different approach that is bringing a new conversation on the table of the industry.
Yeah, I'm totally on that. I'm calling them enfants terribles. They are very innovative, very young, trying to transform the language of video games, the language of interaction, and that's why they are here with us today.
Okay, so who are they?
Well, we're talking about Ian Dallas, the creator of the amazing hit What Remains of Edith Finch. We're talking about Hannah Nicklin, who is behind this great indie title called, I love the name, Mutazione.
Mutazione.
Mutazione. You can pronounce it any way. It doesn't matter how you pronounce it. It sounds good.
True.
And we're talking about Chella Ramanan, who is the creator of a very innovative game called Before I Forget. I didn't forget the name because it's a beautiful, beautiful game. And along with them,
Richard Lemarchand.
Richard Lemarchand, our very own Richard Lemarchand, lead designer for Naughty Dog in the Uncharted series, and also professor at the very prestigious USC Games University.
So these minds that think very different from the rest, what are they going to talk about? What is the conversation?
Well, the conversation is how they are trying to innovate, to find techniques and finding ways of telling stories through games, through game design. And there are many ways that you can do that, but they are some of the most, as I said, innovative and some of the better game designers in terms of narrative.
Different perspective, different approaches, and also bringing important topics.
Yes,
like
and
social
taking
topics,
risk and
politics.
taking risk in that design. So I think they are ready. And Copenhagen is Hannah, Chella, who is in Sweden, and Richard, of course, in Los Angeles, and Ian as well in Los Angeles. Hello, everyone. Hello, guys.
Well, thank you very much, Ivan, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion, Experience, Agency, and Authorship, which is going to be a conversation about the evolving face of story-driven game design. My name is Richard Lemarchand, and as Ivan said, I'm a game designer and a game educator. I worked in the mainstream of the game industry for a little over 2 decades, including, as Ivan said, a stint at Naughty Dog, where I was a lead game designer on the Uncharted games. And now I teach full-time in the USC Games program at the University of Southern California here in Los Angeles. It's really great to be back at Gamelab, and this is in fact my 3rd Gamelab, my first under these circumstances, but we hope that we'll see you all again in person before too long. And I'm very honored to welcome our 3 guests to today's panel, Hannah Nicklin, Ian Dallas, and Chella Ramanan. I'll expand on Ivan's great introductions just a little, and then I'll turn it over to each of our panelists so that they can tell us a bit more about who they are. But Hannah Nicklin is a writer, game designer, academic, and artist. And after a decade-long freelance career in the spaces between performance, writing, and play, Hannah became the creative director and CEO of De Goede Fabric, an indie game studio based in Copenhagen, who recently, of course, launched the multi-award-winning Mutazione, which is a mutant soap opera and a contemporary adventure game for which Hannah was also a writer. Ian Dallas is a game designer and is the founder and creative director at Giant Sparrow, the studio known for their games Unfinished Swan and What Remains of Edith Finch. Ian has a background as a comedy writer, including a stint on the animated genre satire Drawn Together on his resume. And Chella Ramanan is a narrative designer at Ubisoft Massive in Malmö, Sweden. Chella had a long and successful career as a game journalist. She's a co-founder of POC in Play, a video game diversity organization and movement, and has now become a game developer. She co-founded Threefold Games to work on Before I a narrative exploration game about a woman living with dementia, and is working on the illustrated interactive fiction Tales of Windrush about the generation of people who came to the UK from the Caribbean in the 1950s. So guests, just to warm ourselves up a little bit and to bring your voices into the room, could you tell us just a little bit more about yourselves, something else about your background or your time working in games? I think it's very interesting that you've all had careers before game development in these other fields. Maybe Chella, could we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I did a degree in English literature. And then I did a postgrad in journalism and was looking for something to specialize in. And I had a friend who was in the industry, and I was like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. So that's where I specialized.
Or a journalist? Your friend?
No, they were on the development side. Yeah, so producer. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'd hear all the ins and outs of the industries, all the sort of, oh, so and so worked on this, like the sort of rock family history.
Right.
some developers are like super groups and have cool people from that, like really great games, and then they form their own studio. And I kind of liked that, all the machinations of the industry, and which I'd never thought about before when I played them. So I became a games journalist, and I did lots of speaking.
And you had bylines. Your bylines were at a number of different places, didn't they?
Yeah, so I primarily wrote for GameIndustry.com in the US, which is a small website in the US. I had bylines in The Guardian. I did some work for the BBC. I did lots of speaking engagements. Probably one of the highlights was being part of the Victoria and Albert Museum's curated exhibition around games. So I was speaking about diversity in games, in that I was a sort of talking head on a wall next to Rami Ismail.
I was alongside you as well, somewhere else in the gallery.
Yeah, you were. That's right. Yeah. So that was a real pinnacle.
So, and then how did you make your way into development? Did it come was it just a very natural evolution of your career?
I suppose it was, once I thought about it. So I'd always been writing fiction on the side. So I was always trying to be a novelist. I wanted to write books, but I'd never thought about writing games. I don't know. I had some dissonance there. I had and then the Arvon Foundation did a Writing for Games course, and I saw it advertised, and I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. John Ingold and David Varela ran that course, and Rihanna Pratchett was a guest lecturer on that. So it was a week up in Yorkshire, and that changed everything really, because then I went to a game jam. And there I met Claire Morwood, who is my co-developer on Before I Forget, and that's where Before I Forget started. And now I'm at Ubisoft Massive.
Well, and that's very interesting to hear about. I mean, yeah, no, it's I teach in a cinema school, and so I'm used to hearing about those kinds of labs and workshops that can help change the whole course of people's creative lives. So I'm really happy to hear about that.
Yeah, it did.
Ian, I only gave the briefest of summaries of your career, but it's a long and storied one. What would you like to tell us about this morning?
Oh, I mean, I think in the context of a panel on narrative, one thing that I might jump out with is that so I started out as a writer for TV and other things, and then moved into games as a way to stop writing, and that hasn't worked out very well. I feel like a lot of the effort that I spend nowadays is on the writing part of it, and I'm really trying to do less and less of that. Like, I wish that there were ideas for games I was interested in that I could just then go off and make the game part. Like, the writing is the least interesting, but in some ways, like, the most difficult. So something that I do spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about, even though personally I'm much more interested in all of the other aspects of games. And like, I just spent for this new game I'm working on, it's about interactions between humans and animals. And the thing that I'm really most interested in as a developer is a chance to learn new things. So the first thing that I did for this game was to take a year off from game development and go back to school to study animation. And trying to sort of approach this from an animation-centric perspective on game development. And ideally, that would mean that, you know, just be spending all my time animating things and then eventually coming up with a story to fit around those things. But instead, it's like the same old thing of like, man, a lot of time spent coming up with a story that makes sense that all these other things can go into. Yeah, it's this curse that you just can't get away from, that there needs to be some sort of story. Yeah, I think it's like, if anything goes longer than 5 minutes, people get really antsy if there's no overarching you know, sort of narrative structure. But
So I'm really
do a lot
glad.
of writing, I do less and less.
Did you have collaborators on Unfinished Swan and Edith Finch in terms of the writing? It occurs to me, I don't know. Or did you write those games entirely yourself?
No, Edith Finch was an interesting story where, you know, a lot of it sort of came from my own background. I mean, it was in some ways like a pastiche of my childhood of growing up in the Pacific Northwest, and all the things that I kind of remembered about that focus through this lens of what are the more surreal and kind of overwhelming moments, you know, particularly in a natural context. And I worked with a few collaborators, including your friend Tom Bissell, and it ended up being very difficult. I think there were a lot of things that I kind of knew but couldn't articulate inside, and, you know, although it was helpful to have collaborators, it was also kind of difficult on them at times, I think, to be working kind of with this thing that was so poorly formed and constantly changing too. I think like Tom Bissell turned in a draft of one of the stories, and I was like, this is great, let's do a page one rewrite. Now that like we kind of know a little bit more about it, and like I ended up throwing out, you know, more than half, 3/4 of what was there, but that's like, I think a not uncommon situation in a lot of projects, that you do a version, and then like once it's there, you see all the problems and the things that actually are worth keeping. Yeah, so then ultimately Edith Finch, there was a cabal of people on the team that decided that they were really concerned about a number of things, and then it sort of bubbled up organically, and there was like a sort of brain trust of 5 people or so from all the disciplines that got together, and they on their own would like create meetings to discuss situations with Edith Finch, and then that group and I would collaborate, and yeah, it ended up being like a very team-based story project in the end, even though that wasn't necessarily my intention at the beginning.
And I hope that we'll come back to this, you know, as our conversation develops into one about narrative design, because, you know, perhaps we have a tendency to overfocus on writing dialogue, and but of course there are many other aspects of storytelling aside from the dialogue, and then these issues in of like wanting to collaborate early and often, but then just the complexity of it. Perhaps we can come back to this later. And Hannah, I'm always fascinated to talk to you about your creative background, you know, existing as it does in these intersections between performance, participation. Can you tell us a little bit more about the journey that led you to where you are today?
Absolutely, and apologies in advance if you ask me a question and I just monologue over you. I'm getting a bit of stutter in the feed, so it might take me a couple of moments to hear that you've asked me a question. But just to say, yeah, I started out as a playwright. I was trying to count in my head, and it's 15 years this year that I sort of started my career for whatever my practice, I think, is a better way to talk about it. And this is a thing that I often say to students when I'm mentoring or lecturing. It's really useful to initially separate the idea of career and practice, because practice is something you can take care of your whole life. And it's certainly something in other art forms like literature or theatre that we are expected to develop through free workshops, through peer mentoring, through traditional mentoring, and through critical discourse with works that exist out there. And I think that sometimes people in games conflate practice with career and think that you can only develop your practice, have a job that says in the title the thing that you want to be. So yeah, going back to 15 years ago, I started out as a playwright, and I moved very quickly into interactive practices because I actually, in a similar way to Chella, I went to a free workshop at the Soho Theatre in London, which was called Playwriting for the iPod Generation. It was the 2000s, so you have to forgive the quite cheesy name. And it was about sound walks, which are pieces of storytelling designed to be downloaded to an iPod or an iPhone, or like any device that plays audio. And then you go to a certain place at a certain time, press play, and it would repurpose the city streets around you into a backdrop for a story at which you were at the center. And I very quickly saw a form which was much more interesting to me than the kind of fourth wall of theatre, which led me towards interactive practices, very often crossing over with game design practices in terms of like games played across cities, pervasive games, and then using technology and community practices, all as forms of sort of bringing the audience into the work in different ways. I also went via a PhD, which is really roughly like the pub answer to what was your PhD about. For me, is that it was about using interactive practices to destroy capitalism. And it was looking at the history of interactive practices through, there's been many centuries of people challenging the border between author and audience in ways which are also super relevant, interesting, and used in games. And I was looking at that as kind of radical practices. And then I've just increasingly moved more and more into video games because I find it just a really wonderful creative challenge. I often talk about the practice of dramaturgy in theatre, where it's someone's job to look at structure and storytelling and pacing and research and all of the things that takes a story and turns it into a narrative, turns it into this is the way to tell this the best way that you can. And narrative design, it takes that practice and it adds in player interaction, environment, time, pacing, game feel, and so many other ingredients. It's like dramaturgy, but in 3D, and I find that incredibly professionally satisfying.
So yeah, there's so many great jumping off points for us there, Hannah. Like, when I joined academia, it was truly horizons broadening, just in terms of the kinds of practices from other disciplines, and indeed from activism. Most every professor of game design is interested in Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal, theatre of the oppressed. And I think that perhaps we can come back to this later in our conversation. In the present moment, I'm very interested in things like theatre of the oppressed, things like the new games movement, these playful or performative traditions that are connected to activism and impact. So, but yeah, and then what you said about dramaturgy is fascinating to me in the context of narrative design. But let's start off with our first question that I have for you today, because I feel like that as time has gone on, I mean, narrative games have really had a modern renaissance in the last few years. We've got this incredible diversity of approaches to interactivity now, profound improvements across the board in the quality of the storytelling that we've seen in games. Fulbright gave us the social realist drama of Gone Home, subverting the FPS genre, replacing the S for shooting with S for story. Emily Short's interactive fiction showed us the literary heights that text adventures could attain in the right hands. Sam Barlow innovated by introducing the search bar as a core mechanic in her story. And Meg Giant and Inkle showed us that Victorian science fiction could be reinvented as anti-colonial literature, and that mobile games could give us rich, non-linear story experiences. But it sometimes seems that despite this great flourishing, or maybe even because of it, it sometimes seems like things are more complicated than ever before when we try and describe what makes a good interactive narrative or a good storytelling game, and when we try and describe it in a general way. So, panelists, what's your general approach to the work that you do? What are your top-level guiding principles when you think about making the kind of story-driven games that you make? And Hannah, maybe we can start with you.
Really happy to kick off. And I'm also really fascinated to hear the difference between the kind of approach I would take at the sort of indie studio level, and then hear more from Chella about how that translates into AAA context, because I think that the means of working is often has a huge effect on how you make, as it naturally should do. I think one thing to just start off with is the realities of being a narrative designer and a writer. Is often there's a lot outside of your control. The point at which you're brought into a project is often when a lot of things have been decided. There might already be a rough story in place. You might have to spend a lot of time just getting everyone into a place where they have a similar vocabulary in order that you can even usefully discuss storytelling in means which can be translated into their production practices. So actually, as often as not, there are just practicalities there that really govern the decisions that I make when I come into making a story. Not like, to take Mutazione as an example, I come in and halfway through, and there is already a plot. There are already characters drawn. They all have names, there were lots of things about, like, so I was told it was a soap opera. I knew that it was an ensemble cast story, and it was important that it was about all of these characters. So then, therefore, I make decisions which reflect those genre and formal constraints. And a lot of this is actually very similar to the way that I've practiced throughout my career, which is as a form-led practitioner. I feel really strongly that the decisions that you make should always be governed by the materials that you're working with. So I was working with the material of soap opera, ensemble cast, and a bunch of characters and plot that were already being decided for me. So my decisions are around, okay, how do I make this feel like a community that's alive and that exists without you? Well, then I need to make decisions about time and how time works and how time moves forward. There needs to be routine for these characters that exist whether or not you interact with them. You need to be able to miss things in order you don't feel like you are the only agent in that space. And there need to be plots that move on without you, again, in order to de-instrumentalize you as the player with the only person whose story is important. So, and then, you know, soap opera, that's about putting the dramatic next to the domestic. So I need to thread big storylines along with everyday storylines. There needs to be a love interest, there needs to be someone having an affair. And then finally, I also approach the material of this work critically. It's a community in Mutazione who have suffered a trauma in the past, and that trauma was to do with a group of people coming in and trying to access their resources. It seemed very clear to me that part of the way that I dealt with the story would need to be to head-on tackle the theme of colonialism that would be there whether or not I addressed it. And the only way to ethically deal with that was to directly address it and to give room for the characters to address it within that context. So all of my tools are form-led. They're examining the materials I'm given and deciding how I'm going to work with or against the grain of them.
I got to say, Hannah, in my playthrough of Mutazione, one of the things that struck me about it was what you identified, the sense of a living world where time was passing, which I think is something that's very difficult to achieve, right, in the kind of classic style adventure game that Mutazione is somewhat in the pattern of. Very often they feel like there's kind of moments suspended in time. So kudos to you all for achieving that. I think you really did a beautiful job. I wanted to volunteer that as well. I think it's a very funny game, and that for me, in all of the soap operas that I've ever enjoyed in my life, from Neighbours to Coronation Street, there's a lot of comedy in the mix. Something that I think game designers often overlook. We're all so earnest, we're also keen to have our stories be impactful. I think that often means that we feel that we have to be completely straight-faced. But so thanks. These seem like great.
A lot of the work. Sorry, yeah, just real quick.
No,
balancing
no, please.
Sure that there was lightness as well of dark is the way I saw to make those dramatic moments effective. And I drew a lot of influence from long-running TV shows like Star Trek DS9, which pairs a really interesting examination of like a really recent post-colonial relationship between colonizer and colonized. At the same time, they will have a comedy episode. They will have a detective episode. And then there was some serious stuff in the A plot and some light relief in the B plot. And I very much took that as an influence of Matassian in order to build those textures.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then it seems like a general principle, right from your very first comment, is to embrace a constraint, yeah? Famously, the designer's best friend, constraint. Chella, since Hannah called out to you just then, what's your approach when trying to figure out how to make good stuff in this area?
Well, I suppose Before I Forget and Windrush Tales are both stories that I just thought weren't being told. We're not telling those types of stories, so I think that's what drives me primarily. With Before I Forget, it was a game that a story that had been sort of kicking around in my head for a while. So I was like, I had this idea for someone with dementia, and it never made it to the page until I got to the game jam, and then the theme was borders. And I just said to the people I was with, I was like, well, I've had this idea kicking about in my head, and I think borders, applies to this, sort of, about the borders between your personal world and the way the world perceives you, and memory in the past and the present. And so that's how we went with that. So I was right from the beginning, I was like, well, okay, so let's make her South Asian. So she's from India, the main character, because there is almost no representation of Indian people in video games, particularly in lead roles. So that was one of the things. So I'm just driven by including the people that are erased from our stories, who are ignored, and sort of examining. So Before I Forget kind of is interesting because it both examines games and the way that they enjoy and feed off power fantasies. And when you're playing someone with dementia, that is kind of stripped away from you. It not only explores dementia and maybe helps you a little bit. I don't want to overplay the game and the sort of immersiveness of games. Like you won't come away knowing what it's like to have dementia, but you might have a small clue as to what it might be like, some of the feelings you might get. And so it's sort of, confusion is one of the things that game designers don't like to present to players ordinarily. That's one of the things we want to avoid. Is we usually want people to know what they have to do and where they are, where that thing is, and so we play around with sort of timelines and the space you're in. So am
I right? Oh, am I right that in Before I Forget, the space kind of reconfigures itself, like doors that once led to one place now lead to a different place, to kind of as a metaphor for the main character's confusion?
Yeah, so we use it in different ways. So sometimes it's a flashback, it's a fully immersive flashback because she's living in a past moment. So the house changes because of that. The decor changes because you're in a completely different time. And sometimes it's because, I mean, the really clear example is when, well, this is playing with power again. So at one point she needs to go to the toilet, which is not something characters in games do. They seem to have no bodily functions whatsoever. Maybe guards will, and that's when you can like plonk them over the head. That's the only time. So she needs to go to the toilet, but she can't remember where the bathroom is. So we use the sort of the corridor, the sort of the PT kind of looping corridor as an indication of she doesn't know, so she keeps looping back to the same room. So every door you open leads back to this one place. And it was really interesting the first time we watched people play that, because gamers like to succeed and they weren't succeeding, and it really frustrated them. And so it was like a clear example of someone being in our main character Sunita's shoes. You would be frustrated, but she's also, of course, scared and humiliated and all those other things. And you don't make it to the bathroom in time. And so people, after they'd played the demo, would be like, so is there a way? Did I do it wrong? Is there a way to make it in time? I said, no, she has dementia. It's some you don't win with that one, so so that's my approach. And that was kind of central to Before I Forget, really, sort of playing around with the power dynamics that games usually ignore weakness or failure of any kind. And then Windrush Tales is similar because that story is the story of my father and my uncle, and I'm a child of Windrush. So I wanted to commemorate the 70th anniversary, not realizing there'd be a Windrush scandal. I thought it would be a celebratory year as opposed to a year of mourning and sadness and anger and resentment at our government. But I just thought it's a really great space to tell that story of immigration that I feel, and a lot of people feel, was really successful and really built Britain and created a model for multiculturalism that maybe today we don't feel quite as joyous about.
I feel like the Windrush scandal really isn't probably even outside of the UK well enough known about. Also, like it, like the ICE of the UK is the hostile environment, which is designed to make people not want to deal with moving to the UK, and which it's obviously deeply racist. But the Windrush scandal in particular was about people who were directly invited to come from the then Commonwealth to the UK in order to solve our social fabric problems of not having the nurses or the teachers and people that we needed to make our society run post-war, and then handily losing their documentation and deporting them 50 years later. Like genuinely should be known about, and the British state should be absolutely disgusted with itself. And I think that it's worth saying in the context of, like, obviously globally ICE is very well known and everything that Trump is doing, but in the UK we have our own concentration camps. We have these detention centres where we hold immigrants who who may have, like, just for example not filled out the right piece of paper, and they are indefinitely detained on British soil. So I massively I don't know what the right word is, support, welcome, promote like Chella's work on bringing those stories to life in this medium, and people should know. And
no, it seems crucially important to me that games. No, I echo your sentiments and support, Hannah. It seems crucially important to me as somebody who loves games and who, has kind of watched them develop as a burgeoning art form, that they tell stories that haven't been told, that they tell stories that need to be told. And I like your focus, Chella, on this kind of integration of the overt narrative and the mechanics of play. And I really value your subversion of what game players might expect in terms of success or having their goals met. I was recently reading an interesting and pretty famous Ursula Le Guin quote where she says, and I'm paraphrasing her badly here, she says something like modern story writing manuals overemphasize conflict as a source of drama, and there's a huge range of other human experiences, loss, forgetting, bearing a burden that we can look to drive our stories, which I think is really directly applicable for game designers today. So yeah, thank you, thanks. Ian, how about you? You said some interesting things in our pre-session email about narrative design, experience design.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly for me, the starting point is always trying to create a sense of wonder. So that's just, of all the possible kinds of stories or games I could be making, like that's generally the thing that I'm either explicitly trying to do or that I realize afterwards was the goal. So for me, it's really about trying to create something that encourages players to be aware of how strange the world is. I think as a human being, that's the thing that really motivates me, that we can look around, like as humans, we're so good at sort of pattern recognition and then chunking experiences and people and whatever into categories and then getting on with our lives and not being aware of like this bizarre simulacrum of a world that we're actually living inside of, that we're not really seeing the wasp that lands, on our breakfast, that it's like we're just seeing like all of these layers of abstractions that we've built up about that and how we react to it. And the games that I work on and the stories I'm trying to create are things that just sort of push people a little bit, like shove them to see things in a new way and to think about just how fundamentally strange and unknown the world is. And I think tying into Chella's point about that designers, are really loath to confuse players. That's definitely something that these sort of games that I make struggle with, where players are not accustomed to being in places of confusion. And we had a similar situation on Edith Finch to the problem she was describing about players feeling like they had lost, when they couldn't find the bathroom. That for each of the stories in Edith Finch, the player dies. And usually, that's what the whole stories are about, right? Is you're inhabiting their lives at the moment of their death, but that there's this ingrained notion in players that death equals failure. And it's really hard to work against that. Right. And it's something that we kind of have to go in every time and just look at how do players experience this and where are they getting, bumped in Edith Finch. That was something that we spent the whole game development process trying to make death feel less of a failure. And it's a lot of little things like adding, fanciful music and all these just, the sort of traditional, craftsmanship parts of it. But, I think also to Hannah's point about
culmination and completion, these little kind of subconscious cues that tell someone that this happened how it was meant to happen.
Totally, yeah. And it's just looking at the player psychology and, I guess broadly, my working process is coming up with a bunch of problems and then spending the rest of development trying to solve the problems that we've created for ourselves. And I think to Hannah's point about, the way that in their story, it's essentially like a post-colonial take where players are coming, this world on the island, is dealing with the challenge of somebody coming in and stealing their resources. I think that's a pretty good description of the actual facts on the ground for a lot of games. Games, as we have made them, are primarily power fantasies or things about, the expression of control. And that's something that seems to be kind of inherent in a lot of the structures, like chess even, right? Like it's two kingdoms that are fighting together. And I guess there's like a version of that we could make that wouldn't be about those things, but it seems like as humans, that's like one of the sort of easier ways to strip those things down. And, for a lot of games, they're really like they're power fantasies. They're things that players are coming into looking for a way to win. Not usually in a way that helps the environment or the situation that they find themselves in. It's tends to be something that's much more boiled down. And for the games that I've worked on, I think one of the things that's really interesting to me is to go with the grain on those kinds of experiences. Like, what is it that the player is actually doing and thinking about, and then try to make a story that is about those things. And for us, like on Edith Finch, one of the things that we found was generally true is that players are very myopic. Like they just get very focused on tasks that they are given to the exclusion of everything else, which is not necessarily like a good trait and leads to a lot of really bad outcomes in the real world where people just sort of take care of the thing that is directly in front of them and don't acknowledge the constellation, that they're a part of. But for our story, that's something that I think worked really well writing to that, where we would have these stories about characters who got lost in their own imaginations and horrible things were happening in the wings in their lives, and then would eventually in the end of those stories like overwhelm them. And it felt, I think, for players like legitimately satisfying because they didn't really see those things coming, because as players they're falling into that trap of just focusing on this like very shiny thing that is in front of them to the exclusion of everything else. So it becomes kind of a story about attention, which we wrote in sort of backtell. Like we wrote after the prototypes were made, and we looked at like, oh, this is like weird human behavior. But then the writing process was a way of kind of working with the grain on that, and then accentuating some of what was already there.
So the theme kind of emerged from the iterative process of bringing the game into being?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it was, again, just creating these like little petri dishes for some toxic things to grow on, and then looking like, oh, this is like things that are very hard to control and not necessarily appealing, but they're there. Right. And then let's try to culture them and create whatever our version of game penicillin out of the mold growth that we have there from actual players coming into contact with the substrate that we've made.
That's really interesting. And I like what you said as well about just kind of dealing with all of the issues that come up. I'm a big fan of the Script Lock podcast, which is hosted by my friends Nick and Max Folkman. And I strongly recommend it. It's an amazing podcast, Script Lock. It's about narrative design, writing for games. And Mel McCobre was on the show recently, and she said that the creative hat and the firefighting hat are the same hat in the context of game development, which I thought was really interesting, kind of related to what you all have been saying, I think, in various ways. Yes, Hannah?
I really... I find a really useful thought in what Ian just said, which is that that idea of games being power fantasies. I think very often the form, we associate agency with power, but the form of agency that we often think about in games is a very particular, singular kind of agency. So it is the agency of the individual, right? Whereas agency can be any number of things. So in Mutazione, I'm talking about the agency of the community. And so the way that I build the story and the player's agency within that is actually quite limited in terms of the effect that you can have on the outcomes. But the more you explore, the more you uncover about the world. So it's kind of an agency of the collective. Whereas like what Chella is talking about in terms of that sort of toilet scene, that's about the removal of agency as as an active metaphor, as that playwriting adage, show don't tell. Like, this is what this experience is, rather than going, people have these experiences. And it also speaks to how people alone can be disempowered, but that if you better understand these experiences, perhaps you can empower people. You can, so like there's the social model of disability, which says that it is our design of the environment which disables people, not their impairments. And that's very much something that can be brought to mention. There are means of designing an environment which enable someone to find the toilet if they need it. So like all of these ways of dealing with the power of the player, working against the grain of the expectation of the material of agency, uncovers new forms of agency within the game design. Like everyone's talking about that, and I find that like a really nice theme. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, I really, really like that perspective, Hannah. And maybe I'll move away from our pre-scripted questions a little bit to ask you all. So I think that, you know, repurposing the idea of agency in a game towards, say, the agency of a community in the way that you were just saying, Hannah, is really interesting. And Ian and Chella, in different ways, you were just talking about finding different bases for agency in the games that we play. Do any of you have any more thoughts, maybe riffing off of Hannah's in response to this idea? It's like a fresh approach to agency, a repurposing of agency. I've always been fascinated by Twine games, and some of my favorite game experiences of the last 10 years are these kinds of interactive narratives that are highly constrained, but for me, hugely nonlinear and resonant in a poetic way, in a way that draws my attention to the ways in which my agency, just as a person in the world, is very often curtailed in the way that you were saying, Hannah, by the design of the environment around me or the received ideas about things. Sorry to throw you a curveball.
I think, Chella in particular, I think your work on the Windrush stories, I think there are two sides of the agency here, and to give people the agency to speak their stories when they're not heard is like another form of agency that can be talked about that is irrelevant to players' agency, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And before I forget as well, the role of the unreliable narrator in stories like that are, you know, dealing with memory loss. And yeah, she wrong foots you all the time, because sometimes she says, you know, oh, I think Dylan's in the kitchen, and he's not. She's having an, you know, a hallucination or audio hallucination and things like that. And so, you know, players are used to getting these little breadcrumbs, like, oh, so that's what I've got to do. And then when you get there and it's like, oh no, that's not it. You know, it's again sort of playing around with agency and the language of games that we've built up. You know, that players assume, which is really interesting. You know, if you know, listen to Rami Ismail talk about his mum playing whatever Final Fantasy game it was, and the assumption, you know, how that revealed so many assumptions that we make as game designers, you know, about players and how they interact with our worlds. There's so much shorthand that we expect people to know and understand, and she had none of that. She was just like, no, I'm not talking to that shady bloke down that alley selling guns.
Right.
Yeah, she just ignored him completely, which, yeah, I think is really interesting as well.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of stuff I had in mind, Chella. Ian, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of agency and power fantasies and that sort of stuff, I think a lot of it comes back to wanting to create, as game designers, like a satisfying experience for people. And it's satisfying to feel like the world is responsive to your actions, you know, down to the point where, like, if our phones don't respond to a button press in 0.25 seconds or so, you know, we start to get antsy. And if they don't respond within a second, we actually get really, like, deeply upset, you know, that we're starting to question, like, is this thing, you know, does it respect me? Is it, like, you know, completely broken? And the way that, unfortunately, I think tends to play out is that there's this thought that, okay, well, if control is good, then maximal control is the best. And I think we see that in animation systems, for example, where there's this constant tug between what the designer wants, which is maximal control, which is if I'm the player and I'm walking this way and I decide I want to go the other way, then like we'll immediately turn, and start going that way. And as the animator, that's really unpleasant to be like, whoa, wait, what about center of mass? Like, what about like this sense of momentum and like a real body? And, like the way the animator would want is that it takes, it's like that they think about turning and then like their eyes move first and then the head moves and then the body follows. And then it's like, it takes 5 seconds for you to turn around, especially if you have dementia and you have like, oh, now I'm turning the other way. And so, yeah, I think games have this kind of fundamental problem of the easiest solution to player agency is to give players all of the control, but then that ends up with stories about conquerors. Like those are the people that have all of the control. And so I think one of the things that we noticed on Edith Finch that sort of helped to go against the grain there was that a lot of things that the players are engaged with are actually happening in their heads. So for us, we found that there were situations where even if there wasn't a whole lot of gameplay that they were being tasked with, if we gave them some surprising bit of narrative, like a line that changed their interpretation of events or gave them like a new thing to think about, that was actually pretty comparable. So it didn't need to be something that created an explosion on screen or whatever. There are other ways of engaging the player and kind of getting their brains turning that I think are less explored in game development. But from a story standpoint, there's a lot of room for creating environments that are rich and that keep us thinking about them without literal control, that are things that are a little bit more cognitive challenges instead.
And can I just add
please.
further to it? I'm always doing this, I'm sorry. I get excited about ideas.
No, it's good.
There's something that Chella brought up. She was talking about Rami Ishmael's experience of watching his mum play a game. And as much as I like to be resistant to the idea of moms being our example of people who don't understand games, like my mum is someone who understands like a lot of types of games and enjoys them a lot. I do think that when we're talking about the material of player expectations, it's really important to remember that the player is a material made up of people, and that we need to think through that philosophically in terms of design and practically in a way that's meaningful, that it doesn't assume that our player is a white male, that doesn't assume that our player has a certain Western or a cis experience, that when we think about the effects our design has on a player, we really do our potential audiences a disservice by assuming that they are neutral, because neutral in Western society is the cis white het male. And that, I think, leads to certain kinds of storytelling and design that even when it is telling the stories of others, centers around the white het cis male listening to that story, empathizing about that story. This is made for you to understand someone. Like, I kind of want to play games that don't try and explain to me something assuming that I don't know about it, I want to hear the story which doesn't pander to outside like communities, and that owns that space in a way which it can do if it's not trying to explain itself. So yeah, I think that like Chella brought up such a good point there, which I think it's worth thinking about.
I think that's a great point, Hannah. I mean, it seems. Oh yeah, Chella, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when we first took the game out into the wild, that our first demo, really early days, but there was a Comic Con at the top of my road in Taunton, which is a small market town in Somerset, and they gave us a free table because we weren't selling anything, and I was just like, this really isn't going to be our audience for the dementia game with like a woman in her 50s. but it'd be rude not to because it's just up the road, and we've got nothing to lose. So we thought we'll go there. It's going to be kids with their parents dressed as Wookiees, and Darth Vader's going to be there. They are not going to be interested in this, and we were really surprised at the level of interest it got. We were the only game there. There was game stuff there, but we were the only game demoing there, and so yeah, we had people all ages, and I didn't think kids would be interested in it, but they really were. And there were sort of lads of, I don't know, they were maybe 12, 13 who played it, and then they'd come back with their friends and be like, oh, have you heard the piano music yet? Have you heard the piano music? And we were really amazed. And I think we make this assumption that if someone's old, I mean, she's only in her 50s, people assume she's like in her 80s or something, but she's not. She has early onset dementia. So that people won't be interested. And we had real trouble getting investment. People really liked the game and really sort of empathized, and it sort of like touched something in them, and they were kind of excited that it was being made, but they didn't know what it was for. It's like, oh, so is it like, it's more of a like training thing for training healthcare workers. We had this real problem of it being understood as a game just for its own sake, as a piece of entertainment, because it was about something about health. It all of a sudden became a tool for something else.
People often want to instrumentalize games that apparently have a message. Yeah, I can hear Ivan, and I think
I was so engaged in the conversation that I didn't realize that we were running out of time. I think I could be listening to you for.
And I agree, Ivan. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I was about to say that, unfortunately, it looks like we're out of time. We didn't. There was a lot left for us to discuss, but the conversation that we've had this morning has been fascinating to me, and I think we've touched on so many of the topics that we wanted to look at around experience and agency and the co-authorship of communities of players with the designers of the kinds of story-driven games that we're making. I believe that there's going to be a wrap-up session in another room. So we're pre-recording this, folks, but the panelists and I will be live and on hand for you to join us at a link, which I'm sure will be provided. And I guess it just remains for me to thank Chella Ramanan, Ian Dallas, and Hannah Nicklin for your time today. Thank you so much, folks. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, the four of you. Thank you, Richard, so much for your help. And yeah, we'll continue talking in the other room. Thanks a lot, and see you very soon.
Thanks, Ivan.